On occasion, yeah, when you're out there, you're kind of reminded in these kind of really impactful ways that this isn't just a TV show you're making. This is real life, right? And it can kind of startle you out of the lull of the kind of cadence of production you get yourself into, where you spend this much time and you interview this many people, and they're kind of this template for this thing, and if you get too lazy, you lose sight of the fact that like this is this is the real world. This isn't a television show you're making.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to the Jalapeno Podcast. This is Ty, your host. Today's guest, Ryan Duffy, correspondent and video journalist, known for his work with Vice, Huffington Post, and Nat Geo, has spent years uncovering surprising stories around the world on topics like drug wars, illegal mining, the Japanese love industry, and more. In this episode, Ryan shares some of his experience as a correspondent, including his approach to reporting and storytelling, along with some useful tips on interviewing. I'm grateful for Ryan's willingness to record the conversation and excited to share it with you all. Thanks for tuning in, and here we go with Ryan Duffy. Okay, cool. So you're good to go now?
Ready to roll, bud.
Okay, awesome. So I was hoping that we could talk about your trajectory to where you are now. I mean, as an adventurous, curious person, it seems like you have sort of an ideal situation as a journalist that gets to travel the world and uncover all these incredible stories. So can you tell me more about how you got to where you are today? And
yeah, sure. It isn't really this grand plan. It was a series of kind of luck and stubbornness and right place, right time-ism. Grew up in Jersey, always kind of had an interest in journalism, edited my school paper in high school and all that normal shit, and then figured it, that seemed like a reasonable thing to do with my life. And I went to New York City and decided I'd go to journalism school. While I was at NYU, I was kind of doing the journalism program, and it was sitting there in the regular program of learning in the liberal arts school. So you're in math classes and science classes and all that. And goddamn, I hated math. I've always hated math, and I suck at it. It really, dude, awful. So I'm sitting in this like remedial math class freshman year in NYU, going, well, I don't understand why I'm going into debt for the rest of my life and still taking classes that I hate. That doesn't compute. So I switched schools within NYU to this school called Gallatin, which is an individualized study. You make up your own major, and you have no core requirements. You just kind of wing it, which your parents are thrilled about. And they're like, great, it's great. We're sending you to New York, and you're just making shit up. But it was great for me, and I ended up focusing on documentaries a little bit more broadly than journalism. Just the idea of documenting, and the kind of blurry line between something like gonzo journalism and inserting yourself into the story, the merits of that versus not, objective versus subjective, all those themes. And, those things seem so important when you're 19 years old. So I did that for 4 years, and towards the conclusion of my time at NYU, or about halfway through, I had an advisor who was like, hey, you're paying all this money to live in New York City, go get an internship. And the only place I could kind of reason out in my head that I would ever want to intern, work for free, essentially was this magazine called Vice, which at the time was just a monthly print magazine that I picked up at my local record store, and I loved it. I was just one of those kids that treated it like Bible. So I showed up at their office, and I was just like, hey, do you guys want an intern? And they were like, no. And we did that dance for a couple months, and eventually I wore them down, and they were like, yeah, okay, fine. You can intern here, send some magazines via FedEx, and clean the stairwell. So I did that for a couple years and kind of ingratiated myself in that company. They hired me the day I graduated. At that time, it was still only about 10 people. And just hung on for dear life, and that's the part where like I could pretend that I saw, 21-year-old me saw the grand vision of Vice and knew that in 10 years it would be an international multimedia company with 3,000 employees. No, 21-year-old me went, this is a cool place and they have fun parties, and I would like to work here with my friends. Yeah. So I did that, and then Vice within it was late 2006 we started making video. So there was, for just a couple years into my kind of full-time tenure, I graduated NYU in 2004, raised my hand to be a part of this kind of nascent, weird little video experiment we were doing. First with a DVD called Vice Guide to Travel, and then with this joint venture we did called VBS.TV, and then eventually with Vice.com, and then the YouTube channel, and then the MTV show, and then the HBO show after that. So in that way, it was just, I was very fortunate, lucky, grateful to have lucked into a place at a particularly fortunate time in the company's kind of trajectory, and its ambitions and growth lined up with mine, and we started doing more serious work as I started getting a little bit older and feeling a bit more serious myself. The appeal of Vice when I was 20 years old was they have parties where I can, have a couple free beers. And the appeal of Vice when I was 30 years old was I'm traveling around the world telling stories that are important to me and my friends. So it dovetailed nicely with my own kind of maturation, I guess.
Right. That's interesting. And there's something to be said too about following your intuition, because I'm sure there was something about the story of Vice as an entity, I imagine, drew you in too a little bit at the beginning.
For sure. Yeah, look, it's when you are 19 years old, which I was at the time I was first reaching out to those guys, I don't know that I had any set of criteria to evaluate things by outside of like, do I like these people, and do they seem like people I'd hang out with on the weekend? Like that. Right. That was a very rudimentary kind of reasoning system I worked with, and it served me in that sense, because they did. It was a company that was started by people who I felt like were like me, and that's the reason I was drawn to the magazine in the first place. Was it talked in a tone and in a way that me and my friends talked, and I felt like it's a trite old saying, but it's a conversation at a bar as opposed to this kind of soapbox upon which you orate to the masses. Vice was never that. So it was great, yeah. And then look, I did that for 10 years, pretty much to the day. So from 2004, summer 2004, when I graduated, to summer 2014. And then pretty much went, okay, I've learned more in the last 10 years than I thought I would in a lifetime. Am I the true test of myself is, am I smart enough to now take some of this stuff out and do it in other places, do it for myself, most importantly. And that's what I've been doing for the last couple of years, and small sample size, but early returns suggest I may have just internalized just enough to be able to do it on my own. It's an interesting time to be in. It's an interesting time to be in media. It's an interesting time to be in news. It's an interesting time to be in content, even on the most broad level, in the sense that for a long time, content was controlled by this handful of companies at the tip top that were essentially monopolies, right? There were very few gatekeepers, and they were in control of essentially everything. And we've now hit a point where the spectrum has swung almost entirely the other way, where individual content creators are in charge of their own content. And then you have a whole new layer of platforms and distributors with reach and scale that dwarfs what traditional linear distribution could ever offer. But, that's a complicating factor in and of its own right. On one hand, it's like, well, great, it's democratized and everyone can do everything. But when everyone can do anything, it's kind of tough to find the good stuff. Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I wanted to ask you about your approach when you decide what to cover. If you are given the choice, knowing you have an audience, knowing that you kind of have a responsibility in a way to deliver something of value.
Yeah, good question, man. It's constantly evolving, I guess. But for me, I think that it's these bigger picture issues, right? Whether it's climate change, or whether it's race relations, or whether it's take your pick. But they're stories that are kind of they're a layer under the breaking news. They're the things from which these flashpoints crop up. the tragedy down in Texas is a story, is a breaking news story about what happened in Texas in this church and who this guy was and why he did these things. But there's obviously the kind of layer underneath there is a story about gun control and a story about arms in the United States, and that is fraught with years and years of deeply complicated political back and forth and machinations. That's the area that interests me more. And particularly when you dig into an area like that, for me, it's less about kind of the scorecard type reporting. Well, and again, like I only get to do the type of work that I do because smarter, better people do the factual scorecard type stuff, right? There's someone who's laying out clearly for the paper of record, here's the both sides of the gun control debate, and these guys want this and these guys want this, and this legislation has been proposed. And I rapidly consume that stuff. I don't quite have the brain for it myself. So I'm a little bit more interested in the layer, kind of maybe one step down from there, which is, well, who are these people and what are kind of the fundamental beliefs that are at the root of this thing, and putting kind of human faces and character-led stories behind this stuff.
It's a fundamental story that you present that I think is perhaps more appealing to someone who's approaching, who's curious about thinking for themselves and understanding a story on a larger scope versus just being told what's happening and what you need to worry about and what you need to think.
Yeah, there's that for sure. Although I do, I really do think like I crest off of the fact that other people are doing the hard factual work. I couldn't do what I do without that, because I think you need to have that baseline factual understanding, but now more so than ever in our post-fact world, of what the brass tacks of the story is. And then you can kind of go, okay, I'm interested enough in this to try and understand it a little bit more, and let me understand kind of who some of the players are, what some of the characters actually think. Let me hear from them directly, and hopefully that's where I can do that. But I do think, what you said is true too, in the sense that funnel works the other way for some people who perhaps are not necessarily avid readers of the news or are just too busy to necessarily keep up with the day to day, and it seems like everything's at hyperspeed at the moment. That you can, to the extent that you provide a compelling narrative and storytelling and interesting characters and kind of big, bold visuals to a story that could be dry as rendered in black and white print, I think you do broaden the base of that on a basic level, right? You can hook people in with say the storytelling, and in the process of them sticking around for the story, they perhaps they learn about an issue or a place, right, that you might not have known about before.
Right. And your style too is also approachable, and you seem to be acting like yourself and not trying to do anything other than to be yourself.
It's kind of you to call it a style, and it's a complete lack thereof. It is. Look, it's. And I think this is something I credit the guys at Vice for this, because that's kind of where I was in the formative years of this. But like, there's remarkably, and it's different now. There's a ton of news veterans who've worked at big companies who work there now. But at the time that we were first starting this, there was no one. I went to J school for a semester before I transferred out, and there weren't a lot of people who had kind of proper journalism backgrounds, and there certainly weren't a lot of people who had done broadcast news or really done television at all. So we were just walking around with cameras and learning how to use them on the fly, and there was no one to tell us, hey, you're supposed to actually present a little bit differently, you talk in a different voice, or you don't curse, or whatever. I don't even I'm 35 years old now, I don't even know what the conventions would be, but whatever those conventions are, we never learn them, for better or worse. And I tend to think it has served me for better, at least, in the sense that you don't necessarily, when I am somewhere covering a story, I was in the Philippines. I went to the Philippines for Nat Geo at the end of last year, and we did a big piece on Duterte's drug war, which at the time everyone was doing, and a lot of people were doing really, really well. BBC was there, New York Times was there, The Guardian was there, everyone was there, and it's as they should be. It's a massive story, but I do think on a very basic level, I kind of present differently. I read differently to people because I've got a very small crew, and I'm not wearing a suit and tie. Not that these people were in a suit and tie, but I think that kind of the lack of style or the lack of kind of reporting artifice or construct has enabled me to kind of wedge my way into some local scenes and situations that may have been closed off to a more traditional media approach.
And what is your kind of mentality going into a story? I'm always curious about the research and the preparation and how you approach a conversation.
It's something I think about a lot because for me, it's a fine line, I think, between, you obviously always need to be super well researched and prepared. You need to know the landscape you're walking into. So months of research go into any story before anyone jumps on a plane and flies out anywhere with a camera crew. But at the same time, I'm a little cautious to overlearn anything, if that makes sense, because I do think that some of the most compelling stuff that I watch is I'm drawn to correspondents or hosts or reporters or whatever who are actually experiencing something in real time, and I'm kind of along for the journey, and I'm they're kind of a vessel or a surrogate for me to have that experience, and they're asking the questions that I would be asking from home. So it's just tricky. I try and stop short, and it's easy for me to do because I don't consider myself an expert in much of anything, but you want to stop short of hitting some level of you don't want to ever believe that you are the expert or that you are going into the story and you already know how the story is going to end. You want to go into it being open to finding stuff out, because that's what reporting is. That's what journalism is tracking down leads, and you want to be open to having your mind changed, right? You might have an idea of, I think this is this, and I think this guy's the bad guy and this guy's the good guy, and these people are getting fucked in the end. And you go there and you find out that actually the good guy it's a little bit more complicated. There's a bunch of gray area to everyone, and everyone's fucking everyone else or whatever it is. But you going in with preconceived notions, I'm rambling, but going in with preconceived notions is very dangerous. So research and prep is unbelievably important, but stopping short of believing you know anything until you're on the ground is certainly wise.
Right. I've heard writers say that, they go into a book and they don't know what they're going to say, because in doing that, the lesson that you're representing is that you should be receptive, you should be open-minded. Have there been any particularly dicey situations that may have led to an interesting insight or revelation while reporting?
We've certainly been detained a few times when filming. It happened in India, and it happened in Egypt, actually, in a way that will always stick with me. We were covering Arab Spring in Egypt, and we'd been in Tahrir Square pretty much for the duration and spent a few days covering that, and then wanted to kind of branch out, and we'd gone out to Suez because we'd heard there was going to be a protest there. And while we were kind of waiting for things to mobilize, the Suez Canal was in front of us, and we picked up cameras and were just filming a ship crossing through the canal, not really for any reason other than the fact that, holy shit, I've been reading about this since third grade. And now we're seeing it. Isn't this cool? What we didn't realize was that we accidentally were filming kind of past and through a military base. So as we were filming the ship, in the foreground we caught military, and all of a sudden we saw all those guys grabbing their guns and kind of mobilizing. We were like, oh, okay, there must be some protest or some conflict going on. And they came pouring out the gates, and it took a minute till we realized, oh no, there's no protest. There's just us. It's just us on the kind of butt end of this peninsula, and they're all sprinting at us with guns drawn. And as we were panicking, we started to move back towards the van where all of our stuff was. I just out of preservation instinct, I guess, and at very least to put our gear away and try and kind of secure that. As we did, our driver just took off. And I can laugh about it now, but at the time it was terrifying. But our driver just booked it. The door was open, shit was flying out, and he was gone. And we ended up getting detained. He made it out, but then they caught him too, and they brought him to the same holding cell as us. And we were like, "Hey, dude, what the fuck was that, man?" And he was apologetic, but his basic thing was like, "Yeah, guys, I live here." He's like, "It's cool. You're going to get detained. It's going to be fine." And it was, we were able to contact the embassy and ended up getting out after, an unpleasant, 9 hours or whatever it was. And, his point was like, "I have a family. I live here. The consequences for me extend far beyond, this little job where you're paying me a day rate." And, I'll always remember that, right? Like the small little inconvenience for us ultimately was like something that, can impact people's lives, people who put their neck out to help us, not just people who we interview and are brave enough to talk to us on camera, but people who drive us around, and then, of course, you always see it on these micro levels too. These situations that make you feel conflicted, and you feel it all the time when you sit down and talk to people. You feel this kind of tension between what you're there to do and the gravity of what someone is telling you. I've talked to people who have been in just all sorts of horrible situations, from religious persecution, from economic persecution, and otherwise. And you kind of sit down with them and you get this window for all of 90 minutes into whatever horrible situation they're dealing with. And they share with you so candidly their suffering and everything that they've gone through. And in the back of you're listening and you're engaged, but there's also a part of you that's there to do a job, and that job is to get this story told succinctly and eloquently in a format that will be impactful for the television show, for the American audience. So you're there and you're listening and you're in the moment, but you're also kind of floating above the situation, trying to think about, okay, this is unbelievable. This person is telling me these deep fears and this horrible reality that they're dealing with. But do I have it phrased the right way? Do I have the bridge that gets from this idea to that idea? It's just I think it's a reality of a job. I can't imagine I'm the only one who deals with that, but that does stick with you, right? Like that you can't help but feel a little bit odd about that. You can't help but feel on occasion, and at worst, a little bit predatory in that sense. And, you tell yourself, and I do, that the ultimate good of helping to tell these stories is worth it. And I think that it is, or else I wouldn't still be doing it. But in the moment, it can feel odd to be worried about, the making of a TV show when someone is kind of bearing their soul to you.
You mentioned your intake of news. Where do you look? How do you make sense of the deluge of information out there?
Oh, it's tough, man. If I had that answer, I would I would be doing it, right?
Right.
If I knew the product to kind of coalesce everything, I would certainly be trying. And there's a lot out there. It's like we were saying before too. I think some of the most interesting companies right now are companies who are concerning themselves with curation, recommendation,
yep.
and kind of funneling. I mean, for me personally, there's a newsletter that I'm not breaking news on this, but thousands of people subscribe to this, but Jason Hirschhorn is the guy's name, and he does a site and a newsletter, and I think he's turning it into a larger platform called Redev. He just happens to, it's called Media Redev, and then he's got Sports Redev and Fashion Redev, etc. He just happens to choose a lot of stories that I'm particularly interested in, so his funnel matches mine, and that's helpful. I mean, I'm still an avid subscriber and reader of the New York Times. And I think they do great work, and I think I also think there's stuff in that paper that infuriates me, and I'm happy for that, right? Like I think that's important, and I think there's a troubling faction of people who they want to read the New York Times to read 8 different columnists who agree with them completely, and then put down the paper and go, "See, I knew I was fucking right."
Yeah.
I don't know that that's what the paper should be doing for us. I don't love reading columns that kind of challenge the existence of climate change, but I'm interested in it. I'm interested in that perspective. I'd like to understand it more so that I can, be more informed in my conversations around it. Right? That's not a position I suspect I will be convinced of anytime soon, but I'm interested in how someone else might have gotten there, for sure.
Right, and willing to entertain the conversation, even if you disagree with it, whatever it may be.
Yeah, for sure. And that's like there's a great. This is also I'm shouting out things that everyone listens to or reads, but I also listen a lot to Pod Saves America. And I was listening to a recent episode this morning, I think, and there was a conversation around someone asked a question about how do I engage with someone who has a different point of view on politics, and politics is so tribal and fraught right now, blah, 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 which is a great question and something I think we've all wrestled with in the last couple of years. And the point was made in return, I think the first thing is to not approach it like it's an argument that you're setting out to win. Right. Coming to common understanding doesn't mean that you've convinced a person to agree with you or even that you agree with them. It just means that you've said your piece, they've said your piece, you've asked a couple important questions, and you understand how they got to where they got to. And if you come to that common understanding and you're not looking at the person across the aisle like, you're a fucking alien, I don't understand how we could look at the same set of facts and you could have that conclusion, I could have this one. If you can at least bridge the gap of okay, I completely disagree with you, but I know how you got to where you got to, then I think there's that puts anything in play, right? Then you can have a substantive conversation. Then you know how they got there. You know what matters to them, and you can potentially engage them to see things your way if you want, or you can just know that you've made it a reasonable connection and had a civil conversation with another human being, which is often enough.
Right. You mentioned how much you learned within those first 10 years at Vice, and I imagine that you're learning every day. Could you talk a little bit about what are the skills that you've learned and sort of what do you continue to work on?
Yeah, I think I continue to work on making sure. I'm 35 now, and I feel it, right? It seems like a weird thing to say, but I turned 30, I didn't feel 30. I turned, I went through it, and then I got to 35 and I went, oh my God, here I am. And I think it's in part, I feel like, because I go running and now I'm sore, and you're like, oh yeah, I'm in my mid-30s, great. But more importantly, I think I feel it because I'm now looking at people who are doing unbelievable reporting and work and stuff on the front lines, and I'm going, holy shit, you're a child. You're 23 years old, or you're 19 years old, and I want to be conscious of the fact that I came up, I learned journalism, reporting, video content making, whatever I learned during a particular era of, early 2000s, mid 2000s, 2010s, kind of digital focused reporting. And there's a lot of lessons that are important in that. And I'm glad that I learned in that arena, but I'm also aware that that's now a decade ago. Right. And the things that I believe are the way to do my job. When I was 25 and just starting to do this, and I was a smug asshole that I hope to think I'm not anymore, we would look at 35, 40-year-old newspaper reporters and go, we're coming to eat your lunch. See you later, old man. Yeah. You don't know what the fuck's going on in this world. Yeah. So I'm now very conscious of the fact that I'm the 35-year-old guy, and just because I don't, put on a newsboy cap and work at a newspaper doesn't mean that some of the ways that I do things aren't outmoded or dated or no longer the best way to do things. So I'm trying to constantly stay on my toes to learn to avail myself of kind of new production techniques or distribution mechanisms or whatever it may be, but just basically to maintain a sense that I don't know nearly as much as I like to think I do. And then in terms of stuff I learned, I think we covered a lot of it, because I would say if there's a singular thing that I learned, it's that if you are acting differently in front of the camera, or while you're holding the microphone, if you're doing a podcast or if you're reporting or whatever, if you're acting differently than you would be otherwise, then you're doing something wrong. I just that to me has been the biggest overarching lesson of just like just be fucking normal, right? Be relatable, be human, listen, be empathetic,
Right.
and be real, right? Be willing to be affected by something you learn or by someone you meet, and be willing. That's one other thing, which is more of like a tactical thing, is like, but it ladders back to what we were talking about before with like, don't go into something with too much of a preconceived understanding of it. Is be willing to go down a rabbit hole, right? Like some of the best stuff that I've done is like you lay out all this stuff in pre-production and you're like, okay, we've got 5 days in country. Day 1, we're doing, these B-roll shoots, and day 2, we're going to interview this guy at his house, and then we're going to go say, and you back out every minute of the time that you've got in this country around this story, and you piece it all together, and then you get there and you meet some guy at dinner one night, and he goes, oh yeah, well, if you're here to talk about that, then you need to meet my friend Bob, because he knows the real story and he's at the bar around the corner. Do you want to come talk to him? Like, you got to be able to say yes. You got to be, if Bob's the right guy, but like, you got to be able to like chase something down and take some risks and disabuse yourself of your overwrought schedule a little bit, and kind of be in the moment, in the place, and trust your gut a little bit. Yeah. Which is a hard, it sounds so obvious, right? And it's easy to do when you're young and dumb and don't know any better. But like, the more you know, the harder it gets to do that stuff, because you know stuff that shouldn't infiltrate your thinking about a story, but it does, right? You know the budget, right? You know that if you go and you spend an extra day in the country, then they've got to change everyone's flights, and that's really expensive. And then you got you got to pay overages to the camera people, and like you just start thinking about all that stuff, and you're like, that's not the lens that I should be using for this. But you know too much, right? You've been in too many meetings now, and you're thinking about a bunch of shit that isn't really what you should be thinking about, which is, how do I get the best story out of this? So you got to kind of return to your roots a little bit sometimes, and just chase the story like a kid who doesn't know anything else.
Yeah, that's great, because it sounds, you said it sounds obvious, but to me it doesn't, for the reasons you listed. If it's under the umbrella of a large, corporation-backed production, where maybe they're not, maybe you can't change course. So it's good to hear, again, that open-mindedness. I heard Ken Burns talking about his recent documentary on the Vietnam War, and he said something similar, that like they approached it a lot like that, with that mentality of basically saying, we don't know, we're going to pretend like we don't know anything, and we're going to improvise, go down rabbit holes as much as we feel is truthful, because we want to convey the full scope of what happened, not have our mind made up beforehand.
That's cool.
And so like, especially something at that scale, to hear that was reassuring.
Yeah. For sure. Did you watch that, by the way, all 18 hours of that?
I've started it. It's free on PBS, so it's like I haven't finished it, but it is like, I think it's 10 or 11 episodes that are each over an hour.
Good Lord. I'm all at once, I'm fascinated by it and completely intimidated by it, right? Like the idea of once I start watching it, I'm going to need to finish it, because I have a compulsion about that. So like, the moment I press play, I might go into a black hole for a weekend. So we'll see.
It's dangerous. There's another question I had about, when you're covering a story and you're excited about it, or you're about to interview somebody. I imagine you might receive pushback, or it's a contentious situation that you're in, and you feel threatened potentially. How do you deal with that? Like, how do you deal with like a hostile interview subject, or someone who's reluctant to talk to you? Or
yeah, I mean, it's tricky. I don't know that there's like a master playbook as much as a case by case set of tools you got. I think one of the things that I usually remind people of, and it it's worked. It doesn't always work, but it has worked. Is look, you can talk to me or you cannot talk to me. That is, the power is entirely in your hands. But if you choose not to talk to me, I'm still doing this story. So then the power is totally in my hands, right? And So I would just, I try and encourage people to have a bit of authorship, right? Because the story's happening one way or another, and if either it's going to be your voice or the absence of your voice, and the absence will speak louder. So that works sometimes. And then, sometimes you get people who agree to talk and then are adversarial all the way throughout. They're some of the trickiest conversations you'll have. I try to just be cordial. I never want to be contentious, because that's that's dumb, because you're not going to get anything out of anyone. And B, typically people don't want to watch other people have uncomfortable conversations. We all have enough uncomfortable, awkward interactions in our lives that we're not like, I'm home from my work day of having awkward conversation with my coworkers. Let me watch someone else do it on Netflix.
Yeah.
So I do try and keep things cordial. Obviously, there are situations where you're interviewing someone and you need to push back, and that's where things can get not cordial. Like if you know that someone is lying to you, or you suspect that they're not sharing the full truth and something that you're really trying to get at the root at, then you need to kind of get a little bit more I guess aggressive. Aggressive isn't the best word, but you know what I mean. Firm. Yeah. And I think that one of the things, and this is a lesson I'm constantly trying to remind myself of, that is actually one of the best lessons. There's two in interviewing people. One of which I think I stole from Alex Bloomberg, who runs a podcasting company called Gimlet. And he said, he actually did this masterclass in interviewing that I'm such a fan of his that I bought. I think I paid $100 for eight episodes of it, and just listened to him talk about how he interviews people. I think it was on Creative Live. But his lesson was you have to embrace sounding stupid. And which goes back to your point about Ken Burns, is you have to approach something going, I know nothing. It's so many people, and I have this natural inclination. You want to demonstrate that that you've done your research. So you're sitting down with someone and you're like, yeah, so I know that in 1974 legislation was crafted to say, and it's just this isn't, no one's, you don't get a gold medal for having read a couple articles. You need to play the part of vessel for the audience at home, and you need to assume that they may not know that. So the question, it doesn't come across as an affirmative statement. In 1974, there was legislation. So was there ever any legislation? And then let the person guide the thing. The interview is never about you. It's always about the person you're talking to. And then the other thing, and I can't remember who I stole this from, but God knows I stole it from someone, because I don't have many good original ideas. I might have stole this one from Thomas Morton from Vice, and whether he said it to me or whether I just watched him do it a lot, I don't remember. But you need to be comfortable with silence. We have this natural inclination that when a person, the social contract we have is that a person stops talking and you start talking, and you just go, and you're like, okay, thanks for your answer. So my next question is, blah, blah, blah. And it's yeah, in conversation at dinner, that might be the appropriate way to interact. In an interview, take a minute, digest, think about what they said, respond thoughtfully, ask a follow-up question if it merited a follow-up question and you didn't get the full answer. But the idea that you're just going to have that ready the moment they stop talking either means that your question isn't very good, or you'd started thinking about it halfway through their answer, in which case you didn't really listen to their answer. So there's a different type of cadence to interviewing. And the other thing that happens, by the way, when you just are comfortable with silence, when someone stops talking and you don't respond, is they're uncomfortable too, because they're like, what's wrong with this sociopath? They're not engaging me. So they'll just keep going. And a lot of times when you get people into a place where they're just trying to fill the dead air so you're not in an uncomfortable situation, they'll end up saying the most illuminating shit in the world, because then all of a sudden they're just like, whoa, okay, I guess I didn't give them enough. Here's really the story. And you end up getting the more honest stuff in the kind of part two of the answer after you just let it sit for a minute. There you go. You're doing it, aren't you? I'm not falling for it.
Oh man, no, that's
That was pretty good,
that's
dude.
great.
It was good, except for the fact that since we're talking on Skype, I was like, it works really well in person, but on Skype, I'm just like, oh, so my internet went out again. Fuck.
Yeah,
all
yeah.
right, I gotta call Ty back.
I wasn't gonna hold it much longer.
It was good. It was good.
That's it for this episode. Thank you, everybody, for listening to the Jalapeno Podcast, which is a joint effort between Aaron Mason, Caitlin Watkins, and me, your host, Ty McDonald. I appreciate everybody tuning in, and of course, thank you again to Ryan Duffy for being on the show. Keep your eye out for Ryan's work, Nat Geo Explorer, the Players Tribune, and I'm sure, inevitably, a whole slew of interesting things to come. Thanks again, everyone, for tuning in. This is Ty McDonald, signing out for now. Be well.